Hey fearsome friends, I've got 14 true Insidious stalker stories for you tonight. From serial rapists to children to what you thought were friends. They creep up on you when you least expect it, no matter how vigilant you might think you are. So sit back, relax and get cozy, comfy, warm, 'cause it's time to let your nightmares in. Years ago, I lived in a condo with my 2 dogs, Smokey and the Bandit, who are brother and sister from the same litter that I got as puppies. For reference, their mother was a Sheltie, Smokey's father was a German Shepherd, and Bandit's was a Husky, so they were both a good size, with long, thick coats, which made them look a lot bigger than they actually were. Personality-wise, they were both big babies, who loved people, and would happily lick you to death given the chance. One night I got home late, around 2:30ish, and took them out for a run and a pee, something I had of course done many times. I lived in the back side of the condo on the ground level, and the backyard was a huge park-like setting, divided up by intersecting pathways, kind of like a square with 4 quadrants, and was surrounded by other condos and houses. The area right in front of my condo was a big field with a pathway about halfway through, running parallel to the condo, and to the left of that was an area around the same size, divided up between a large playground area and a forested area with a pathway running through it. I headed straight out of my condo and across the pathway when I noticed someone. It was a tall, skinny man dressed all in black and was whistling whilst walking along the path I had crossed over. As I ran with the dogs, I noticed the whistling had stopped, so I looked over my shoulder and saw that the man had diverted off the path and was now walking directly towards me. I immediately thought, "Oh, this can't be good," and took a hard left and ran into the playground area. It was well lit, but there was also a huge man-made hill that I assume was leftover dirt from when something was built, and it had become grass-covered. I ran around the hill into the dark where he wouldn't be able to see me, and stayed there for a minute to formulate my "what the hell am I gonna do" plan. Luckily, I knew the area very well, having spent hours walking everywhere with the dogs. The playground was bordered on one side by the forested area, so I crept through the trees to where the path ran through, circling back toward my condo, keeping close to the shadowed area, while hoping and praying that I had lost him, or he had lost interest. The forested area ends basically where the backyard of my condo begins, and still hidden, I looked around the open area ahead and couldn't see anyone. I made a break for it and started running like hell. Up to this point it was just like any other walk for my dogs, who had happily galloped alongside me, seemingly unaware of any danger. But as I left the protection of the forest, the guy jumped out of a nearby group of bushes. I had a good head start on him, but didn't know how fast he was, so I just kept running and didn't look back. Now what happened next still amazes me to this day. As I was running, the dog still at my side, Smokey, the female, all of a sudden stopped dead in her tracks, turned around, and assumed the "don't mess with me boy" stance. She was snarling and growling at the guy, which stopped him dead in his tracks too. Bandit, the male, stuck right by my side like glue until we got to my patio. I turned and looked back and almost laughed at the guy, as Smokey was still standing her ground in full-on guard dog mode, and he was standing there looking at her, hands up in surrender. I called Smokey to come and she backed away slowly, barking and growling until she decided it was good, then turned around and ran right back to me. I kept my eyes on the man the entire time, and he didn't move an inch until the dogs and I went back inside, which we did as soon as Smokey got there. I immediately called 911, and within minutes the entire backyard area was swarming with cops. The cop who interviewed me said that there had been numerous reports of sexual assaults in our area, and they figured it was the same guy. Unfortunately, other than tall, skinny and wearing all black, I had zero info on what he looked like. I don't know if they ever caught him, and I never heard anything more about it. When everyone was gone, I had a good long cuddle with my wonder dogs, complete with them licking away my tears. After the adrenaline and everything wore off, the gravity of what could have happened and how damn lucky I was finally hit me. And for the record, I had done lots of different modes of training with them, but never anything that involved protection. What they did was 100% instinct, that I didn't even know they had in them. It happened a few years back. I was in my school year of bachelor studies and sharing a huge flat in the centre of a beautiful French town with my sister Corinne. Corinne and I had the biggest flat among our group of friends. Therefore, every party would be held at our place. After a year and a half, we got so used to seeing each other's group of friends that she knew all of my friends and I knew all of hers. We lived on the first floor, and the window of our living room was directly facing the street and the entrance of the building, so we could easily see who was coming in and out. Also, front doors in France can also be opened from the outside, which made me a little paranoid. I would always keep the door locked and would leave the key in the lock, and every time someone rang the bell, I would always look out the window first to make sure it was someone me or Corinne were expecting. One Friday, Corinne had gone away for the weekend, leaving me home alone. I was sitting in the living room when someone rang the bell to our apartment. It was very weird as I wasn't expecting anyone, and all of Corinne's friends knew she was away. I looked out the window, as I always do, and saw a guy I didn't recognize, with a backpack, wearing a coat and a beanie, talking to one of our neighbours and saying, "Oh, thanks, I was looking for Corinne Essen." I told myself that it must have been a friend of Corinne that I didn't know, a friend she wasn't really close to and who didn't know she was away, so I let him enter the building. First of all, our doors had no numbers and didn't have our names written on them, therefore people needed to know which door was ours, and we often had to remind them. But this guy rang the right door without any indication. I opened the door a little and saw a complete stranger that looked extremely weird, and as soon as he saw me he exclaimed, "Oh, hi, you're Veronica Essen, right? I'm Mark Gregoire," and then started chatting with me. I didn't let him enter my house, so we stayed at the door as he was talking to me. This complete stranger whom I had never met before knew everything about me and my sister. He knew our age, he knew my sister was gone for the weekend, he knew our origins, and apparently he also knew one of my sister's best friends, Anais, and said that she had told him about us, which was a lie. He also knew what we were studying. He said he had the same origins as us and was trying to talk to me in our native language. He literally knew everything about us, even before I'd started talking. I got so scared I told him I had something to do, so I had to leave him. He seemed like he wanted to enter, but gladly he left when I asked him to. Afterwards, I locked my door, called Corinne and Corinne's boyfriend, who told me he could come and stay with me if I had any problems. We told this story to all of our friends, including Anais, but nobody had heard of him before. We told all our friends to be careful from now on when they come to visit, and actually one time, a few months later, some of our friends saw him again, waiting in front of our building for us. Thankfully, he left after a while, though. He had also tried to add us many times on Facebook, but we blocked him every time. So I'm turning 20 in a month, but this happened when I was in 9th grade, and I was a naive 15-year-old just starting the big high school life. I live in Hungary, so we have a different school system, so bear with me. When I started high school, I decided I wanted to be part of the chorus of the school. mostly because I had to get 50 points of community service to be able to graduate 4 years later, and if I went to the chorus, I got 15 in a year. So I go to the second week of school, and that's when I met him for the first time. Let's call him George. We go around the group, and everyone says their name and a few things about themselves, the usual. I didn't even notice him at first, because he was sitting at the back and was very quiet the whole time. Everything goes well, my life goes on, and nothing really happens. But during my first 3 weeks, I decide to take part of a school program that focuses on students with good grades and an interest in nature. I joined because I was obsessed with chemistry and biology at the time, and I wanted to do as much as I could. When I joined with a few of my other classmates, everything went smoothly. We went to this school program every Friday afternoon and stayed in the school laboratory to do some experiments and studying, etc. Then after about 2 weeks, the teachers decided that they wanted us to mingle and to not just group up with our classmates. This program only allowed 9th and 10th grade students, so they manually picked our partners. I got partnered with a few 10th graders, and one of them was George. I kind of recognized him, so assumed he was just from school. Usually I'm friendly and chatty, so I became fast friends with everyone. Well, more like we know each other's names and say hi. Time goes on and he reaches out to me over Facebook. We chatted a bit and he was shy but friendly, and I was being friendly back because I didn't want to come off as rude. But I knew that some boys think if you're being friendly that you're flirting, so I intentionally kept him at a distance and talked about boys and stuff, wing-woman him a little. You know how it goes. I then got a boyfriend. That didn't really last long and it doesn't really add to the story. But I knew he didn't like that. We were kind of friends because we were in chorus and the science program, but nothing past that. Time went by and it's been about 4 to 5 months, and I know by this point that he likes me. I had just broken up with my boyfriend, so he knew that I was free. I held him at a distance, but he started to act weirder and weirder. At first I thought it was because he had a crush on me and he didn't know any better. But then it just got even more weird. Like when he'd go to the fountain to drink, which was located right outside the classroom, he would be able to watch me through the doorway. He would also, on Facebook, keep an eye on who I was talking to. I had guy friends at the time, and whenever he saw me talking to them, he wouldn't leave me alone until I'd told him who they were and if they liked me or not. Mind you, we aren't even really friends at this point. He kept following me in school, on field trips with the chorus and the science program. One time I caught him taking pictures of me, but he laughed it off when I confronted him. Another time he was showing me pictures on his phone, and he accidentally showed me a picture of my own ass. I was standing normally with my back to him, talking to my other friend in the program, and he'd taken a picture of my ass and legs. He laughed it off again, said it must have been an accident, but the photo was clear and I was perfectly in the middle. All this was weirding me out even more, so I created more distance. Time went by, and he was texting me as much as he'd always been, and sometimes even more. But I tried to ignore him and curb him softly. Before anyone says I should have been firmer, I understand your point. But we also had many mutual friends, and we were still in the program and chorus, so I didn't want to make it awkward for everyone. I kept blocking his attempts of breaking out of the friend zone, even though he wasn't even my friend. He was still following me, looking up everyone I knew on Facebook and Instagram, etc., etc. And he'd started this crappy game where he would tell me what I was wearing, even though I didn't see him at all that day or week. He didn't have many friends, especially in my class, so no one told him what I was wearing. So I don't know how he knew what I was wearing, because me and all my friends were looking out for him. The worst thing about this was the embarrassment that I felt when my friends would see him and everyone had to focus on keeping me out of his sight. They'd feel uncomfortable by his presence and creepiness too. One time I was wearing a knee-length skirt with a normal t-shirt with thick black stockings, and he messaged me, in his mind a joking way, but in reality a very creepy way, that he had to go to the bathroom because he almost had a little problem in his pants, meaning he'd almost creamed his pants. Gross. I ignored him more and more, ghosting him, looking away, not talking to him, and hoping he would take the obvious hint and go away. But he just got worse. He was starting to text more sexual messages, asking why I was ignoring him, gaslighting and manipulating him. I felt really uncomfortable every time he was just in the same room. My birthday was coming up, and a week beforehand he sent me a screenshot of his gallery in his phone, and he had a whole folder of my pictures. There were over 47 photos of me in it. Some he had screenshotted or downloaded pics from my social media. After that, I didn't upload anything at all. I blocked him finally, but he messaged me on another platform, asking me why, and that he understood that I hated him, and that he got it, blah blah blah. I felt bad because he didn't have many friends, so I unblocked him. Big mistake. He thought that meant that I liked him back. After that, he was unavoidable. At every school function, every day he would find a way to annoy me and my friends. He spread the rumour that we were together, and that I loved him, etc. I had to find a new route to the bus station, because he memorised where I went, and had started to go that way, even though the dorms were the opposite direction, just so we could coincidentally meet. Finally, summer had come, and we went on break. He went home. He lived in the capital, and I live in a small town 80 kilometres away. But he just kept messaging me the usual creepiness, sexual stuff, stupid anime pictures, which were his favourite. When I posted after months that I went on a motorbike ride with my brother, who was 22, 23 at the time, he downloaded the pic and sent it back with the caption, "I want to have a motorbike so I can visit you every day." He kept hinting at the place I lived. Luckily, he didn't know exactly where it was. At this point, he was messaging me multiple times a day, and he wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't message him back anymore, and basically just ignored his existence. I got a summer job where I reconnected with an old friend who I told everything about this guy. She mentioned that her best friend is a muscular guy who likes to help girls like me and scare away guys like George. So I said okay. At this time I was desperate to get George off my back. I was even thinking of asking a guy friend of mine to pretend to be my boyfriend for money. But I met her best friend, and soon after meeting him, we started dating. I told him all about George, showed him the evidence, and he was absolutely disgusted by him. Summer came to an end and we went back to school. My boyfriend went to a different school in the same city. The chorus went on a trip, and we went to the school's lake house, which was a crappy little cabin. George was there, of course, and luckily my friends, who were very upfront and very confident, were there too. So I tried my best to ignore him and pretend he didn't even exist, and my friends separated us the best they could. One evening after the chorus meeting, though, he waited for the opportunity when my friends had gone to the bathroom and I was alone. He'd cornered me between him and the wall, and I was sitting on a couch, so I couldn't really leave, because he was standing in the way. He reached out, and in his sweaty hand was a ring. He said he'd bought it for me. I told him to keep it and give it to another girl who likes him back, but he wouldn't let up. So I got more and more anxious that he wouldn't leave me alone. I waited until he moved a little, and slipped past him and bolted upstairs to a room that I was sharing with my friends. I told them what had happened, and after that we avoided him even more, if that was even possible. After we got home from the trip, I told everything to my boyfriend. He told me that he would talk to him before our next trip to Poland for our school chorus stuff. So he does that, and George said he will back off, and said he was sorry, etc. But he just continued with his crap. He glued himself to my group of friends and wouldn't leave us alone. He was lurking around, waiting for me to be alone so he could ask about my boyfriend and why I was letting him dictate our relationship. Luckily, my friend was extra, so she positioned herself between us at all times, which I was extremely grateful for. After we got home, I told my boyfriend everything, and he talked to him again, but it made no difference. George just kept up his crap, so I told him that my boyfriend wanted to talk to him again. At first, George escaped through the side door of the school and told me that my boyfriend didn't show up to talk. I laughed at him, because my boyfriend was right next to me and reading the message. He was waiting for over an hour, just to tell him to piss off. Well, next time he didn't escape, because I was there, so he came out to talk. After an excruciating half hour, we went home to my boyfriend's house, and he told me it went good, and then I went home. That night, George messaged me, told me that he wanted me to tell him to leave me alone, and didn't want my boyfriend to manipulate me to hate him. I got so mad and ran to him and chew him out for his crap for the past year or so. I blocked him after that and everything was fine. He didn't reach out again and left me alone. He probably hated me too. Good. But do you think that that was the end? Of course not. After 5 months, he messaged me again and told me he was sorry, admitted he was wrong and would like a second chance. I warily accepted, hoping he had changed. I know, naive little me. Well, he did change, because he'd made up an imaginary girlfriend to make me think he didn't like me anymore. But he kept trying to coax me into going to his dorm to play pool. I said no, and he got mad and I chewed him out again. I told him to leave me alone, and clearly that he hadn't changed, and I didn't want him in my life anymore. I told him he needed to just go away, like he had for the last 5 months. He finally blocked me on Facebook and left me alone. For a week. He messaged me again, and I told him to leave me alone again. After that, he didn't try anymore, and I think had just found himself a new target. The new girl looked like me, hair colour, length, height, and eyes, and she goes to the chorus too. But I left the chorus, and the program was over, so he didn't have an excuse. After a year, he started showing up at the store I went to, and was there every day for 3 years, at the exact time that I would be there. He could have gone there 20 minutes before I arrived, and we would have missed each other. But he went when he knew that I would be there. One time I was standing in line, at the end of the obviously longer line out of the two, and he stood behind me. He didn't talk, he just looked. I was getting mad, so I decided that I would not go to that store for 2 weeks, and eventually forgot about it. But after a while I went back to the store at the time I usually did. And before you ask why I would go the exact same time every day, it was because I got off my 7:05 bus at around 7:45, and this was the only store that was on the way to school. So I would just go in around 7:45, buy my breakfast in under 2 minutes and be done by 7:50, and still had 10 minutes to walk the 3-minute way to school. After that, I noticed that when at a school function, he would look at me multiple times and would quickly take his eyes off me when I noticed. But thankfully he then graduated and moved to a different city 100 kilometers away. I have kept him blocked, but one time he was stalking my Instagram profile. He accidentally clicked the request follow button and quickly deleted it. I blocked him there too, and it's been quiet ever since. When I was around 9 years old, my friend and immediate neighbour and I were playing basketball in my front yard, when I noticed a small, whitish-grey car parked across the street in a position as such that its windshield was facing our house. In said car was a middle-aged man, clearly pointing a camera at us. I stared for a while and squinted because I was trying to see if he was actually photographing us or maybe just reviewing photos on the camera whilst holding it oddly. But after watching for a while, it was obvious that he was pressing the clicker and photographing us. My friend and I immediately went inside and decided for some reason not to tell my mother, and just went up to my room. Then anywhere from 30 minutes to 1 hour later, my mum asked my friend and I if we could deliver a box of cookies to my other neighbour. We agreed, and, as for me at least, I had forgotten entirely about the prior incident. I guess because I was 9 and having fun with my friend. We walked up the stairs to the woman's house with the cookies and rang the doorbell, but she wasn't home. When we turned around, there was a man in his car. He had parked along the curb right at the entrance of the stairway leading up to the woman's house so that we couldn't walk down the stairs and up the sidewalk without coming in direct contact with his car. I still remember the absolute feeling of dread and panic that filled me, and we immediately began banging on the woman's door and frantically ringing the doorbell, to no avail. The man rolled down his passenger side window and began talking to us. He said, "Clara, it's me, Harry." Clara was my friend. I looked to her and could tell that she didn't really recognize him, but the fact that he was claiming to be someone she knew, talking to us and not immediately pursuing us, made me calm down a little. He proceeded to say that he had lived in the house across the street from her and had a daughter her age that she used to play with when she was a baby. Interestingly enough, Clara said that there was, in fact, a family who lived there who had had a young girl she played with, so that checked out. She said that she couldn't recognize the man, though given the fact that she was 5 when they moved and 3 when they used to have contact, it's not likely that she would recognize him even if he was who he said. He proceeded to say that he was photographing us to show his daughter, who missed her, and said that he was going to record us. He took out his camera again and began recording us in a very interview-like fashion, saying, "Hi, what's your name? What do you like to do for fun?" Now I know for a fact that I told him where I lived in this interaction, but I can't remember if he asked me that directly or if I volunteered it. I think the elation I felt over the fact that he didn't immediately kidnap us made me way too open with him. He videoed us for roughly 30 minutes to an hour, then he drove away. This story honestly gets more disturbing to me the older I get. There is no way that this man, the self-proclaimed old neighbour to my friend, was videoing us because his daughter was nostalgic for a friend she had when she was 3. Why was he back in the neighbourhood? Where was his family? There was no reason to wait outside our houses for hours just to film us after already photographing us without our consent. It makes me sick to think about what was done with those photos. Who is this man who knows all the young girls of the neighbourhood, past and present? And what did he do with those photos and videos? This happened about a year ago, just after the start of the first lockdown in the UK. I'm a 22-year-old female living in a rural village in the south of England, and the only roads in and out of the village are really long, unpaved, unlit and empty 95% of the time. I walk along these roads for my daily exercise, and the one where this happened is my favourite, as it has a ford crossing that cars have to drive through. The crossing turns into a river, which I sit by, read next to, etc. And after sitting there for a bit and listening to a podcast episode one morning, I decided to start walking home around 10 a.m. About a minute after I start walking, a red SUV with 2 men and 2 women inside goes past me, heading in the opposite direction. I didn't pay it any mind. Loads of farmers or horse riders have SUVs out here, so it's not uncommon to see them. I kept walking for maybe 15 seconds before getting a weird feeling that I needed to check behind me. I turned around and saw that the SUV had parked on the side of the road. The 2 women and one of the men were stood by the car, which now had its boot open, and the other guy was walking on the same side of the road as me, about 30 meters behind, and he was looking straight at me. I automatically sped up, and after a few seconds turned to see that he was even closer now, and walking even faster. I know I won't be able to outrun him, and the chances of someone else coming along to help were basically nil. The only thing I could think to do was call my friend and talk loudly to try and put him off. The first time I called, she didn't pick up, but I was just tempted to pretend I was on the phone. Thankfully, she picked up on the first ring of the second attempt, but she launched into a long rant about why she overslept and how mad she was that she'd missed her alarm, and didn't really give me a chance to speak. I had to cut her off mid-sentence and be like, "Hi dude, yeah, I'm just calling to tell you what my plans are for the day. I have so many things to do," super loudly. And I turned my head to the side so the guy could see my earphones and was aware that someone else was listening. After turning my head, I kept walking, and I didn't look back until I was quite a bit ahead of where I was. Fortunately, the man was no longer following me, and I couldn't see the car. I breathed a huge sigh of relief and apologized to my friend for cutting her off and letting her know what had just happened. I still don't know if this encounter was anything sinister. Maybe they'd just broken down and needed a hand. But I'm glad I didn't find out. Just a note for this story, the school we went to had 2 playgrounds. So my older sister and I used to walk everywhere because our mum wasn't around much as she was always working. We lived a 2-minute walk away from our old elementary school, and a lot of the kids in the neighbourhood would go there after school hours, so we'd find ourselves there too most days of the week. Up the road was a cluster of fast food restaurants, so we decided to grab dinner from the local Burger King, and afterwards didn't feel like going home, so walked to the elementary school. It was around 7 p.m, so we knew nobody would be there, and we both sat on the top of the slide and talked. It got dark pretty quickly, and we thought it would be fun to play hide and seek, because we knew it would be hard to find each other in the dark, and with 2 playgrounds to hide around. We played a few rounds and it was my turn to count. I counted on the concrete with my ears covered to make it harder to find her, and when I was done I went right to the first playground, when I heard a loud slam coming from the building's back door. I immediately looked over to see somebody opening and slamming the dumpster lid. Now me being my paranoid self, I just hid and kept my eye on him. I had no idea where my sister was, but was more worried about the man. After looking into the dumpster, he just stopped and stood there and started talking to himself. Since we were at a distance, I looked around the area for my sister and whispered her name, but I got no response. The man was still saying random things to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. After a few more minutes of sitting still in fear, I heard my sister say my name, so I turned my head and saw her standing by the other playground. I booked it towards her, and she whispered to me to run, so we both ran to where there was more light, when she told me to stop and walk and act like we were just out for a stroll, so the person didn't think we were trying to get away from him. After we'd walked to the parking lot, we saw a security car and sighed with relief. We laughed at ourselves, thinking it was just a security guard, so we continued walking to the entrance gate, and the car left. Once we began walking on the main road to get home. Keep in mind this is a main road and there are cars constantly going through. I got a strange feeling and looked behind me. My heart dropped to my stomach as I saw someone following behind us coming from the school. I immediately whispered to my sister and she looked back as well. I could see the fear in her face as she noticed the man wasn't thin, so we knew we could outrun him if we really needed to. Although we were close to home, my mum was working and we didn't want the man knowing where we lived. So my sister and I started to speed walk, when I looked behind me again to see the man had started walking faster. We bolted and turned into our driveway, hiding behind a few trees. Luckily, we had a long driveway surrounded by woods, and it was dark, so we continued looking at the road for the man. After a few minutes, we didn't see him anywhere. But I'm not sure what would have happened if he'd caught up to us. But I don't want to find out. I'm a female, and when I was 17, I was living in one of those towns without the community feel. It was a toxic place, rampant with drug addiction and crime, and I learned from a young age to watch my back and where not to go past dark or ever. This town held a lot of trauma for me. Some trauma is even scarier than this incident that I'm about to share. But I left this town a few short months after this incident, and I would never think of moving back at this point in my life. For context, I was working a lot and finishing up my senior year, and we didn't have a working washer and dryer at home, so I had to go to the laundromat to do my laundry. Now, I lived on the outside of town, and it took 5 minutes to get into town because we were so secluded. There were no street lights, and I lived on a street between two mountains. We were down the street from this abandoned dairy farm, and we had acres to ourselves. We were really isolated. It was so dark out there, and there was only my street and the cross street to get to mine, so you knew when a car was on the road. One afternoon, I found some time to take my laundry to the laundromat, and I took my mum and brother's laundry with me, so my mum wouldn't have to go during her work week. This meant I had 3 times the laundry to do, and it would take longer. But there was a Hastings next door, so I didn't worry too much, as long as I was able to leave before dark, as it wasn't a very good area to be in. By the time I left, the sun was almost down, so it all worked out. I was on the cross street to get to my street. It was completely dark, and I was all alone out there. Or so I thought. I turned onto my street, and within seconds there was someone behind me, as close as they could get without hitting me, and they had their brights on. This confused me, as I had seen no other cars before I turned onto my street. It was like their lights were off until they were directly behind me. This gave me a pit in my stomach, so I sped up, but they kept up behind me. This was a windy, dark road, and my headlights were poor, so I was really starting to get anxious. I made a judgment call and drove right past my driveway. I didn't feel right possibly alerting some creep to where I lived with my mum and baby brother, especially since cell reception was so poor out there. The person behind me was still as close as they could get to my bumper, and I kept speeding up. I knew that up ahead there was a fork in the road. Going straight would lead to the downtown area, and it's the way people go when they are heading that way. To go to the left, you entered a residential area with only a few homes, and a road that only really allowed 1 car at a time. At the last second, I turned onto this street, without turning my blinker on, in hopes that the car behind me would keep driving straight. But they turned with me. By this point, I was very scared, but still hopeful that maybe the car behind me lived in that area. We were going close to 50 miles an hour by now, and just speeding up, as the car behind me really wasn't backing off, but staying as close as they could. They stayed so close, in fact, that I couldn't even tell the make of their vehicle, or whether they were driving a car, SUV, or a truck. I definitely couldn't tell who was in the vehicle. But I couldn't understand why they wouldn't back off, and I was afraid that if I'd slowed down, they would rear-end me. All of a sudden, I saw a home directly in front of me. The street was a 90-degree angle, and I had to turn left or crash into the home in front of me. Luckily, my car made the turn. I kept going and made a left to get onto the road that leads downtown. The car was still behind me. They didn't live in that neighborhood, and at this point I'm sure they were following me. I made the decision to drive to the sheriff's office, but I wasn't sure how to get there. We were going around 60 miles an hour in a 25 zone, and we started to pass a street that I recognized would lead to the sheriff's office. So I turned, but I turned so late that I might as well have made a U-turn. Finally, the car behind me can't make the turn, and they kept driving. I drove around and made a lot of turns to ensure the car wouldn't end up directly behind me again. And finally I pulled my car over and cried. I was safe this time, but I went home terrified, and it changed the way I drive to this day. I moved to a more populated city, and I live in a large apartment complex, but I still drive past my apartment when I get a weird feeling about someone behind me. Anytime someone pulls into the apartment behind me, I drive right past my apartment and circle the complex until I can park with no one behind me. My paranoia possibly saved me, and my mum and baby brother, from something that could have been so much worse. Pay attention to people behind you. Waste the gas and drive past your home if you're scared. It may save your life. So I had told my story about the time I was knighted in a buffet parking lot by some psycho church official from Delaware, and it got me thinking, are there any other creepy encounters that I've had? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. The ironic thing is, this story also takes place in middle school, when I was in 7th grade, having the worst school year ever, and was shortly before this event that I had been knighted, just to give you a time frame. To start off the bat, I'm a straight male, just to give you context to the story. But anyways, here's where it begins. There was this girl in my neighbourhood who I had been friends with since the 4th grade, when I had switched school districts. She was a grade below me and seemed like a nice enough girl. We talked on the bus frequently, until I didn't see her for a year, when I went up to the middle school in 6th grade, and she was still in 5th. I didn't see or hear from her in that stretch of time, but little would I know she would change significantly. When her and I finally crossed paths again, it was on the bus, just as it had been before. At first she seemed like the same friend I used to know. We had definitely drifted apart, but I tried to make up for lost time. I soon came to realize, though, she was a bit weirder than the last time we talked. She acted strangely, constantly trying to strike up conversations or poking her head up over the bus seats like a gopher looking at me. I was really weirded out by it and tried to cut down verbal conversations with her to a bare minimum. You'd think that this is just a normal goofy middle schooler, acting like they always do, and that things can't really escalate. I thought that too. That is, until her brother came into the picture. Now we'll call this girl Jenny, and we'll call her older brother Jake. Now Jenny was a year younger than me, but her older brother was 3 years older than me. He was a 10th grader at that time. A year before, I had sat with Jake on the bus since some idiot decided to steal my seat when I got on at the end of the day. At first I thought it would be fine, and that maybe I'd get along with him. After all, he was known to be a decent kid who was super nerdy and introverted, much like myself. The thing is, I didn't know to what extent this was true. Within minutes of me sitting there, he was trying to tell me nerdy jokes. And believe me, it wasn't as fun as it sounds. At all. They were so dry and bland it was painful. I kept checking my phone to see what time it was, because I couldn't wait to get off the bus and away from this guy. I myself was awkward, but not nearly as awkward as this dude. When the bus finally got to our stop, I hightailed it out of there and never sat with him again for the rest of the year. Even when it came to a day that there were 2 people already in my seat, I squeezed in. But anyway, back to 7th grade. So not only was I trying to avoid contact with Jenny, now her brother comes into play. Somehow over the last year, he had started to develop somewhat of an obsession with me. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the signs became clear pretty quickly. One day Jenny popped her head over the seat and told me she wanted me to draw a portrait, I asked her of who and who it was for, and her response made my blood run cold. Jake asked if you could draw him a portrait of yourself. He'd like to have a picture of you, and he knows that you're an artist. Now, I have always been the artsy and creative one in my school, even having been voted most artistic of my senior class this year, so it came as no surprise that he knew I was great at drawing. But it did surprise me that he wanted me to draw a picture of myself for him. I mean, who does that? Who even asks for that? That's just really weird, and it immediately raised red flags in my head. I told her no, that I wouldn't, and she told me that Jake would probably be upset. I wondered why he wouldn't just ask me himself, but heck, he probably knew my answer would be no. He might even have figured it would sound creepy if he himself were to directly ask it of me. It didn't stop there, though. There were a few other times like that where Jenny would ask me something that her brother wanted to know. I would rarely give her an answer, and if I did, it was a vague one at that. Then I became more observant on the bus rides to and from school. I would be sleeping with my head propped up against the window, when suddenly I would wake up because I felt as though I was being watched. I would then turn around, and sure enough, Jake was staring at me with a blank expression. I tested this just to see if that was a one-time occurrence. Over the next few weeks, I would spontaneously whip my head around at random times to see if he was looking at me. Each time I caught him in the act, his dead blue eyes monotonously yet intensely gazing at me, his face devoid of emotion. But a few times I could have sworn I saw a smug look behind his piercing eyes. It was at this point that I began to not feel safe on the bus. This guy was seriously weirding me out, and there was no end in sight. My grades began to suffer in school, and at the time I thought it was because I didn't grasp the concepts in class, but looking back on it, this probably factored into it. One day things went too far. The bus pulled up to our stop to let us off for the night, and I immediately started speed walking as soon as I hit the street. You see, my house was up a long stretch of road that went uphill, and then I would turn and go up an even longer hill of driveway to reach my house. Therefore, I had quite a trek before I reached the safety of my abode. So I was speed walking up the street, when all of a sudden I heard Jenny call out, "Hey James, you better run." She said it in a sing-song voice, and I was extremely confused. Then I saw him, running across 3 sets of yards, Jake sprinting over to me from his house, which was diagonal from mine and about a block away. I freaked out and walked even faster. I don't know why, probably because of my fear, but I couldn't run. He caught up to me and slowed down, walking beside me. Then in his terribly awkward manner, he tried to make small talk, but utterly failed. I can't even remember what he said, probably asking how my day was, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from this stalker. He kept walking with me up the street, even when I crossed the road to the stretch that led up to my house. For some reason, my brain not functioning properly, I only prolonged my experience by stopping at our mailbox to see if there was any mail. Grabbing the newspaper, I told him I had to go, and then I walked to the edge of my driveway and started hiking up. He watched me for a few seconds before shouting goodbye and dashing back across the street. As soon as I knew he was gone, I started running full speed up the hill to my house, unlocked the door and threw myself inside. I ran upstairs to where my mum was sitting on the couch in the living room and had a breakdown. I was in tears, terror filling my brain, not knowing what to do, and spilled everything out to my mum. I had kept her up to date on the weird goings-on, and up to this point she had decided it didn't warrant anything needing to be done. But him following me to my house, that was enough for her. She called my school and immediately got the vice principal involved, who also filled in the main principal. The vice told my bus driver, who then switched my seat to be closer to her and forbade Jenny and Jake from talking to or sitting near me on the bus from then on. The main principal then contacted one of the assistant principals at the high school and had him pull Jake out of class and question him, while he pulled Jenny out of her class to do the same. Both my parents and their parents were called in for meetings, and to our horror, his parents even knew about it all. They'd said for months now Jake had been obsessing over me, confirming what we all thought. No matter what they were doing, whether it be eating dinner or just relaxing, he only ever brought up one topic: me. Ultimately, two conclusions were reached. Jenny was really just a pawn in Jake's weird obsession and hadn't really done anything wrong, besides just being a strange girl. Jake, while his actions had seemed suspicious and creepy to my friends, parents, and myself, were deemed the actions of a socially awkward high schooler who was harmless. They figured that all he was just a guy who didn't know how to make friends and found someone who he wanted to be friends with, but didn't know how to go about it. I just find it strange that they said this all while knowing that even his parents had admitted they were scared by how obsessed he was with me. I still don't know what to believe. I don't think he was just an awkward guy looking to make a friend. He mentally scarred me, and now I'm insanely selective about what male friends I have. This unfortunately though wasn't the last time I was stalked by an older guy, but that's a story for another time. The strangest thing is, and what really creeps me out, is something that happened a couple of months after Jake was banned from being around me. My sister and I were outside in the yard playing around, doing some fantasy game we had come up with, when suddenly, out the corner of my eye, I noticed something. Our yard had a lot of pine trees at the time, and there were two specially lined up at our playground. Well, I looked down and saw two sneakers with sweatpants sagging over the tops, sticking out from underneath the branches at the bottom. I went silent, cutting off whatever I had been saying to my sister, and pointed out the shoes to her. Her face went white. I pointed to our house and she nodded. We both ran like the hounds of hell were on our heels and slammed the front door shut behind us. We told my mum and we all went outside to check and see if whoever was standing in our tree was still there. But they were gone. No signs of anyone being there. My mum thought I'd been hallucinating, and I would have too, if it had not been for the fact that my sister saw it as well. I have a feeling that it was Jake in the trees though. It honestly wouldn't surprise me. We didn't report this to the school since we had no evidence, but this always haunted me. My sister and I rarely went outside to play after that. We were too creeped out by that day's events. I only ever saw Jake a few times after that. When I was a freshman, he was a senior, and occasionally I would be walking the opposite way from him in the halls. When that would happen, I would just look down at the floor until I was sure he was gone. I never wanted to chance a conversation with him, but after he'd graduated, I never saw him again. Jenny gradually became more normal. By the time she was a freshman, I forgave her and we became friends again. We aren't as close as we used to be, but she's a decent enough person now and isn't stalkerish. And that's how I was stalked by a high schooler when I was in middle school, an event that scarred my young mind and is still as fresh as ever in my head. I, a 23-year-old female, was born in a small town in the middle of nowhere and raised to always be polite to everyone, engage in conversation if someone wants to, and not to make a scene in public, but rather always handle things quietly to never disturb anyone else. Now this might work in a small town where everyone knows everyone, and nobody really is a threat. But when I moved to a big city to get my bachelor's degree, I soon had to learn that be nice and always answer everyone might not be the best way to go in every case. This particular encounter happened in my second week in the new city, when I was at the mall to get a few clothes and supplies, since I basically moved with nearly nothing. Always being surrounded by a large group of strangers was a new thing for me, and to be honest, quite intimidating at first, but I soon felt comfortable with the anonymity it provided. Until that day, when I noticed someone was staring at me. not just looking, but really staring and slightly smiling. I was 19 at the time, and maybe not ugly, but definitely not someone that got regularly stared at. Not to say that it's okay to stare at anybody, because that's almost always inappropriate and creepy, but you get what I mean. So I didn't really know how to react, since it was a kind of attention I'd never gotten before. The guy was probably in his late 20s and looked pretty normal, but still, it really made me uncomfortable and self-conscious. I subtly tried to check if my zipper was open, or my makeup was smudged, and if maybe that could be the reason he was looking at me. After I could rule out those possibilities, and arrived on the upper floor of the mall, I decided just to ignore him and get my stuff done. Well, that premise soon failed, as he managed to cut off my way right as I was about to enter a store. He introduced himself, let's call him Steve, and told me that he thought I was pretty and wanted to get to know me. I wasn't interested, since I got strange vibes from him, so I politely told him that I was flattered but not interested. Steve then got very pushy about it, insisted that he would buy us coffee, and afterwards I could still turn him down, and how I couldn't possibly say I wasn't interested if I didn't give him a chance. I tried to say no a few more times, but he just kept trying to convince me, until I decided to let him buy me coffee, because I hoped that it would be easier to get out of it after he had gotten his way. I know that this must be absolutely frustrating to hear, because it was as frustrating writing it. But just the way I was raised and the sheer anxiety led me to believe this was the only solution, and that everyone just always has the best in mind, and that maybe he was even right. Looking back, I was incredibly naive, and just plain stupid. So if you're screaming at your screen right now, just know that I do too, and I've since learned and know better. So we went to the mall's McDonald's to get coffee, and I soon began to realize that this decision was stupid. He let me lead the way, following closely, so even if I tried at this point, there was no possible way to discreetly vanish into the crowd. It wouldn't have felt much different if he had held a gun to my back, I thought at that moment. So we got our coffees, sat down at a table far away from the entrance, but not too far in the back, so that the bathroom was still the other direction than the entrance. Plan B, to just quickly go to the bathroom but actually leave, was now impossible too, since he had a good view of the bathroom doors from his seat. So we were sat there and talked. Actually, he talked and I quietly drank my coffee, and it was as awkward as it could possibly be. I tried to be hella boring so he would lose any interest, just randomly giving short answers and being on my phone, sending my location to a friend of mine, just in case, and scrolling through Facebook. Steve couldn't be irritated by my behaviour, and kept on talking about how he was only in the city for some weeks because of his work and about stuff he did in his job. I didn't get all of it, because we weren't from the same country, and he spoke with a very heavy accent. And I also didn't really pay attention to everything anyway. He seemed sort of genuine though. Not necessarily as if he had bad intentions, just generally very, very pushy. So at one point I made the huge mistake to giggle about something I saw on my phone, and when he asked, I showed him the post on Facebook. This is relevant for later on. When I had finished my cup, I excused myself, thanked Steve for the coffee, but told him that I still wasn't interested. I still thought that being nice about it was the best way to get rid of him as quickly as possible, without making him angry or something. The last thing I wanted was to cause a scene or make the situation even more uncomfortable, so I made my way to the exit, when he gently but firmly grabbed my arm and started to walk beside me to the exit, whilst telling me that we should exchange numbers and ask what my plans were for the rest of the day. At this point my mood started shifting from uncomfortable to afraid. Unfortunately, my instinct in critical situations is neither fight nor flight, but more like prey animal heart attack. So I froze and said the first thing that came to my mind after looking around for a second. Opposite to the McDonald's we were in was a huge bookstore that stretched over 2 floors and a huge space on both of them. From an earlier visit, I had seen the layout of the store before, and knew there were a lot of corners and shelves where you could easily and quickly get out of someone's sight, and also it was fairly crowded at that time of day. So I told Steve, still nice and nonchalantly, that my favourite author had published a new book recently, and that I couldn't wait to get it, so I was going to visit the bookstore. Steve answered something along the lines of, "Great, let's go there. I haven't read a book for way too long," and told me he would pay for mine. So we entered the bookstore and I sort of looked around, read some descriptions, encouraged him to also look around, but he wouldn't leave my side. I tried to distract him by giving him the books that I looked at, so he would have to look at them and put them back on the shelf, all while I already moved to the next shelf. I did this in an always increasing speed, until I noticed he couldn't really keep up any longer, and was visibly confused and a little overwhelmed. And as soon as he paid more attention to the books than me, I freaking booked, pun absolutely intended, out of there. I almost ran through the store, hiding behind bookshelves, peeking out and checking if he'd followed me, simultaneously feeling like a super cool secret agent and the biggest idiot of all time. At one point I could actually see him moving quickly through the store looking for me. I arrived at the counter in the back of the store, where you can pick up reserved books, and as the girl that was working there saw me, I just said, "Someone's following me." Without missing a beat, she opened the little door that led behind her counter, and with a movement of her hand told me to get inside. So I did, and I ducked under the counter and tried not to make a single sound. The employee continued working as normal, and actually seemed as if there were scared little girls sitting under her desk, hiding from creeps all the damn time. After a while she casually said, 5'11", short, dark brown hair, brown eyes, flannel and jeans. And I needed a moment to realize that she was talking to me and describing Steve. So I nodded and she told me he was here some minutes ago, obviously looking for something. But she just saw him leave through the front door, which she could see in the distance. She also told me how she got bad vibes from him and instantly knew it was him who was following me, and that I could stay until I really felt safe. I took the offer and we talked a bit. Just small talk really, about how our days were, and she recommended me some of her favourite books. When I got up from under the counter, I actually bought one of the books she'd recommended, and as I some weeks later read it, I loved it. When I went home, I was always looking around carefully, since I was still trembling from the earlier adrenaline and afraid someone could start following me, or Steve was still around somewhere and actually found me again. The anonymity of the city no longer gave me comfort, but made me anxious. I desperately wanted someone around that I knew, and who could give me a feeling of safety again. But I really didn't know anybody there yet. So I called my best friend just to talk to her, and finally tell her about the reason I'd sent her my location earlier. Later that day I had a new friend request, and many messages in my inbox. My stomach turned when I read the name Steve, and realized he must have found me by my profile picture, or something else he'd seen earlier on my phone when I showed him a post. You can be sure I blocked him instantly, locked my door extra carefully that night, and didn't close my eyes for a minute. I didn't hear from him, until I saw him again almost a year later, on the bus that I take on my way home every day. Actually, I noticed him the same way I did the first time in the mall. I felt him staring and smiling at me. He tried to get through to me, walked beside me when I got off the bus, and talked to me. But this time I ignored him, and told the next huge guy that crossed my way that Steve was harassing me. Thankfully, only a glance of that guy, and the fact that I didn't let this be a private issue, but made it sort of public by involving a third party, was enough to scare Steve off. I still don't know if it was a coincidence that he was on the same bus as me, or if he'd somehow gotten to know what district I lived in, but I never saw him again, and this time for good. Was he trying to harm me? Did he have bad intentions, or did he just try to make a friend and had absolutely no clue on how to do so? Were we possibly utterly lost in translation? I don't know. But luckily there are a few things that I do know now, after I have been in this situation. I have spoken about this encounter a few times, but always made it out to be this funny story, where some guy followed me and I had to hide behind a counter in a bookstore to get rid of him. It's just how I deal with scary things. I make them funny. And people always laugh. But this is not funny at all. Every second of it was absolutely terrifying, and I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. I felt scared and unsafe, and felt like my privacy was invaded, and it really put a damper on my first excitement about living in the city. It also massively changed the way I talk to people, and the way I just walk around town. It doesn't matter how many times your mother told you to be polite and quiet. It's just not always the solution. If you don't feel safe, if you don't want something, don't agree to it just for the sake of politeness. Being polite doesn't mean letting some stranger overstep your boundaries and make you feel uncomfortable. If you can't make it out of the situation quietly, don't be afraid to raise your voice or get attention, or by asking others for help. Don't be afraid you could make it uncomfortable for someone by doing this. Most people are nice and will actually help you. Wrong politeness and silence won't save you, but Natalie from behind the counter in a bookstore and a random intimidating guy on his way home most definitely will. Natalie and bearded guy, if you're out there, you're heroes and I adore you. Nobody, especially not some stranger, is entitled to your attention. If you don't want to talk to them, don't effing talk to them, no matter how much they try to push or convince you. Even if it hurts their feelings or they say you will change your mind about them. In this case, there is no trying to say no. There is only saying no. Don't make the same mistakes I made when I was 19 and so ridiculously naive that I probably was the wet dream of every serial killer or abductor. Treat people with respect, but also treat yourself and your own feelings, boundaries and concerns with respect. One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus is an insanely good book, and everyone should read it. Natalie says so too. Now that I no longer joke about this, it actually really makes me uncomfortable thinking about it. But I'm also sort of glad this happened to raise my awareness in those situations, and that in the end, nothing more serious happened. So this is happening as I write this, and maybe I'm freaking myself out because I read this post daily, but my gut is saying something isn't right. So I'm an in-home behavioral therapist, and I go to my clients' homes, special needs children and young adults, and I see multiple clients every day. As I left one client's home on one side of the city, think of a rather large city, not Chicago or LA, but just a bit smaller, and I'm making my way to the other side of it, about a 45-minute drive, when I see a guy in a blue Dodge Ram following me down the highway and onto the interstate. He's following me down 3 different interstate changes and onto a smaller 2-lane highway, and is still behind me as I drive off onto the off-ramp. I turn left, he turns left. I go about 150 feet and turn right. He turns right. I get near to my client's neighborhood, and he lets a car turn into the neighborhood before turning in himself. I'm already aware that this seems odd, but the neighborhood we turned onto is very large. Think 2,500 homes large, so it could just be a coincidence. I'm driving a bit faster than I should be, so I can outrun this guy if he is following me. Then I park up in front of the client's home, and I'm about 10 minutes early, so I just sit in my car and wait. About 3 to 5 minutes later, the guy in the Dodge Ram pulls up behind me, then backs up and parks in someone else's driveway. Then it sits there for about 20 seconds and pulls back out of the driveway. It goes around the cul-de-sac and is sitting diagonally from my car, maybe 15 feet at most. I got on my phone and called a friend and told her what was going on, and as I'm sitting there for the next 5 minutes or so, the guy is just sitting too and is watching me. I can't see him well, but I can tell that he is bald because his head is shiny. It was now time for me to walk up to the house, so I told my friend that she's to stay on the phone with me as I walk. But as soon as I opened my door, he opened his, then walks to the back of his truck. I picked up my pace, practically sprinting to the front door, and as I'm waiting for the client's parents to open up, I am still on the phone with my friend, watching this guy's every move. He is still watching me and is going to his passenger side door. Then he just sits inside and continues to stare. The parents come to the door and I practically run inside. I want to tell them that I don't feel comfortable, but they're from India and barely speak any English. We actually have to get a translator for meetings because they can't understand much of what we say. The therapy room I use for my sessions faces the road, and I am sitting here watching this guy, peeking through the blinds, and he is still sitting in his car watching the house. I took a picture through the blinds and sent it to my family and said, "If I don't come home tonight, this is the car that took me." I know that it's extreme, but I truly am scared. I think I'm most scared because he's just staring. I also think that if he's still there as I get ready to leave in 45 minutes, I'm going to call the police. Am I overthinking this? Now I know there are a lot worse stalker stories out there, and mine might be pretty mild, but it still terrifies and haunts me to this day, nearly 10 years later. It was my first real full-time job after college. I went to school for art, but the job was basically an admin, along with a bunch of random responsibilities. At least once a week I worked in the warehouse, counting and organising inventory. A co-worker of mine started hanging around and seemed like he wanted to be friends. He was very helpful with the job, having been there for a while and knowing the ins and outs of the company. His name was Tim, was 46, lived in his mum's basement and had never been married. He had a cat he liked to talk about often and claimed he used to be a Hells Angel. He drove 18-wheelers and thought they were super cool. He started offering to smoke me out on lunch breaks, which I would accept because, duh. Then he started buying me lunch, saying, "My friend did this for me when I was your age. I'm just paying it forward. One day you can help someone else when you have the money to spend on them." He knew all the local places to eat and would choose a place, suggesting what I should try. But it was a mistake to ever accept anything from him. But I'm a foodie, and he introduced me to things like Cuban espresso and burger buffets, adding excitement to my otherwise monotonous workday. Around that time, our friend's cat had several kittens. One of them was a beautiful tortie, Penny, that I knew Tim would love. So I fostered her for a bit until he decided he wanted her, and he came over to pick her up. She got along with his other cat and was super sweet. He loved her and would send me pictures of her and them together all the time. We had him over, my boyfriend and I, a few times over a period of about a year. He told the same stories over and over again, but we tolerated him because we thought he was lonely. I made him a dating profile because he often spoke about how he wants to meet the one, etc., but he rejected every single woman he matched with. He would pick their appearance apart, on beautiful women who were in his age group, even some much younger. Now when I say Tim is an unattractive man, please trust. He was gross, overweight and sweaty, had thick, coarse black hair and a huge gap in his incisors that he would suck spit through after he laughed, licking his teeth. He had giant paws and moles, and he was just old. We did have many enjoyable conversations, but I started to get creepy vibes. For my birthday that year, he bought me a first edition of my favourite book, after I had told them this story about how I lost my mass-produced copy. I had exchanged favourite books with a friend who ended up losing my favourite book. Her book was Twilight, which I hated. He also bought me a necklace that was for cancer survivors, which was very sweet, but also kind of really personal and awkward, but still seemed innocent enough. He would show up with a case of beer, knocking on the door unexpectedly. We tried to be hospitable, but it started getting annoying. However, I felt bad for him, and he was always so overly nice and helpful at work, I felt bad turning him away. One day after we had had lunch, while sitting in his truck in our work parking lot, he told me he thought I was the one. I reminded him about my boyfriend, and he said no, he's not right for you. You're supposed to be with me. No, Tim. You know I care about you as a friend, but I am not interested in anything with you like that. You are making me very uncomfortable, I told him. I love you. I can take care of you. Think of all I can do for you. I have a lot of money in savings. Please stop. This is getting weird. I don't like you like that at all. Please drop it, I said, and got out of the truck and shut the door. The storm was brewing. After he'd confessed his love for me, I told my husband, then boyfriend, everything. He had warned me, and he reminded me how he called it, how he always knew this would happen, that Tim's creepy, and that I shouldn't have accepted all the food and gifts, etc. He was totally right, and I felt sick. I started putting distance between Tim and I, while still being kind and sociable at work. I told my husband everything. Tim would call me over and over again, even though I always ignored his call, until one night we got sick of it, and I answered the phone and told him to stop calling me. He was crying and begging me to talk to him, so my boyfriend took the phone and told him to F off and hung up. That's when the threats started. He would leave voicemails about how he couldn't stand to look at Penny, and how he was going to take her into the woods and kill her, or he could just let her free. She would be eaten by wild animals since she was still so small. He said she reminded him of me, and that he hated her as much as he hated me, that he wanted to bash her brains in. I started to call into work sick. I didn't want to see him. He ignored me deliberately, which I appreciated. He wouldn't look at me, but acted normal besides his sudden coldness towards me. Seeing him was awful. I ended up getting laid off, and Tim had other co-workers try to contact me on his behalf, people reaching out, telling me I needed to call him, that he's hurt by my sudden leaving. I would get calls from random phone numbers in my area, and it would be Tim. I would hang up as soon as I heard him say hello. I changed my phone number, and we moved across the country, and it was maybe a year later that he somehow found my new number and called again, leaving this huge voicemail. He said he had found the one, but also he was dying. I can't remember how or why he was dying though. It's all so hazy now. But he needed this innovative technology or surgery that happened to be only available in my town, in my state 1,000 miles away from where he lived and worked, and where we worked together a year before. And he wanted to meet up. It was all such a coincidence, and he was so excited to catch up and introduce me to his pregnant fiancée. He also needed my address. At this time I was pregnant with my first and only child, and Tim said his fiancée was pregnant too, that we would be parents at the same time. At that moment I blocked every single person I had ever known from that town on Facebook, every single person that knew Tim that he could have gotten information from. I changed my phone number again, and the nightmares started of him showing up in the middle of the night, having somehow found us. Of him carrying a case of beer, banging on the door, sucking spit through his teeth. I felt like he wanted to find me so he could get back at me somehow. Looking back, he was a total incel. I don't know if any of his story was true, or what his plans were. This happened literally a month ago, back in February, when my boyfriend and I decided to try out an open relationship for a little while for various reasons. We live separately in one of the larger cities in north of Middle America, and there's a decently sized population of college students, like me, to keep the gay community fresh, so I was doing pretty well for myself. One night I was bored and scrolling through Grindr, looking for an easy hookup, when I got a message from a guy who was barely 800 feet away. He wasn't terrible looking, and I was a little desperate, so I agreed to go to his place. He lived quite literally down the street from me, and I could see his building from my window. So I walked over and he let me up and into his apartment. We made small talk, and I mentioned where I lived. Hell, I even pointed out my window from one of the windows in the stairwell. From the start, I thought there was something off about the guy. Not necessarily bad, just different. He had an odd twitch in his hands when he gripped the banister, and the vacancy in his eyes when he smiled. I'm not so cliché as to say he felt evil or anything like that, but I wasn't exactly surprised that after we got to his apartment, the first thing he did was to tell his very pretty and friendly cat to say hello, and the second thing he did was walk over to the kitchen counter, grab a needle, and shoot up. I hadn't even closed the door behind me. I stood there staring, and he turned around, dropped the needle on the counter, and said, "Oh, man, should have asked. You cool with that?" I am not a Christian boy. I have broken into a church while tripping on LSD. I also had sex on a headstone back in high school. But I have my standards. So I shook my head mutely, pulled my hat back on, and opened the door to leave. The guy rushed over and put a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, you don't have to go. We don't have to have sex. Do you want to watch Transformers 3 with me or something?" "Nope," I said bluntly, hustling away down the stairs. I bundled up my scarf against the early February chill and hurried back down the street to my apartment. He followed me downstairs barefoot, in pajama pants and a t-shirt, until I stepped outside into the whipping winds. I turned back briefly to look after a moment, and he was still standing there in the doorway, watching me. I didn't have any premonitions of doom or weirdness. I grew up in Missouri. Junkies barely register as odd to me by this point, so I went home and went to bed. Now you might have guessed it, but I'd never seen this dude around the neighborhood before. Truthfully, I hadn't seen most of my neighbors because my neighborhood is an odd mixture of white-collar suburbia, college housing, and low-income housing, like my Paramore's building, all on one street. So it didn't really register when I started seeing him more. I would leave for work in the afternoon and he'd be on the other avenue across from my building, strolling along. Or he'd cut across my building's parking lot, like all the kids in the neighborhood did. A couple of times I saw him walking across the campus mall. My apartment building is directly adjacent to my campus, but he'd always swerve to avoid me. Once or twice I'd notice him in the grocery store I work at as a barista, but it's the only one within walking distance, and he mentioned he didn't have a car. This went on for the entire month of February. Eventually I started noticing that he'd always be walking down the street opposite my building when I left for work at my usual time, and he was only ever at the store when I was working. He'd never approach the coffee stand within the store, but he'd look at me. A couple of times I noticed him enter, look at me, pretend to shop and leave without buying anything. I was starting to feel creeped out, but he hadn't done anything yet to make me feel particularly unsafe. One day late February, I worked an early shift. When I got off, I was feeling a little crazy from lack of sleep, and I reached my place about 20 minutes before I usually leave for work. On the corner of the sidewalk opposite me was the guy. He was checking his watch over and over and looking up. I did a bit of brilliant deductive analysis and followed his gaze up to my living room window. Then I looked back down at him, and he looked right at me. There was a moment of tension as we stared at each other in the eyes. Like I said, this dude didn't give off any evil or dark vibes. I've met people that do that. No. What I saw in this guy's eyes, in his face, was much more human and much scarier. Desperation, loneliness, pain, and anger. He hurried after me, but I'm 6'3" and a former sprinter, whereas he was a 5'8" junkie wearing flip-flops on ice. I made it to the first set of doors to my apartment, scanned myself in through the second, and locked them behind me. He walked through the unlocked first set, tried to open the second, tried pushing the handicap button to open them, and then gave up. "Look, man, I'm sorry," he shouted, laying a hand on the glass of the door. "Can we talk about it?" I shook my head. "Absolutely not. Leave me alone." Then I whirled on my feet and stomped over to the elevator. When I turned back, he was gone out into the snow, and I didn't see him for a couple of weeks afterwards, which was nice, because my boyfriend likes to walk down the street past the dude's apartment when he stays over and needs to go smoke. One night my boyfriend was over at my place. He'd just gone out to smoke before we went to bed, and he mentioned that he wanted me to come with him the next time he went out. "Why?" I asked, pulling him in close to me while he shivered. "It's dark and cold and I get paranoid out there sometimes," he mumbled into my chest. "There's this creepy dude that sometimes stands on the corner across the way and just stares at the building. One time he asked me for a cigarette and I told him I didn't have one, when I had one literally in my hand." He laughed, kissed my chin and passed out. I laid there awake, troubled. When I was sure my boyfriend was deeply asleep, meaning after about 5 minutes had passed, I extricated myself and went to the window. It was a cold, clear night. I could see across the street, under the orange glow of the streetlight, was the guy. I couldn't make him out clearly, but when he saw me, he waved. I flipped him off and closed the blinds. I didn't feel like I should tell my boyfriend, because he was either going to immediately go to the police, which I hate doing, or he'd try to defend me. And while I love him with my entire heart, I don't want to watch a fight between a junkie stalker and my underweight, nicotine-addicted boyfriend. So I kept it to myself, and still haven't told him. But I did start accompanying him when he went outside to smoke. The guy was usually out there. Sometimes he'd follow us for a bit before ducking away down a side street. Sometimes he'd watch from a distance. Sometimes he'd be up in his apartment. My boyfriend never noticed. I kept my composure and nothing happened. However, one night, we went out so my boyfriend could smoke, as normal, and when we'd reached the end of the street and turned around, the stalker was behind us, about 50 feet back. I turned my head to check, and there he was. He waved at me again, and something told me I had to get back inside. "Hey babe," I said quietly to my boyfriend. "Let's get back inside, yeah? I'm cold." He kissed me on the cheek. "Okay, I'm almost done anyway." We walked back to the apartment building, and without turning I knew that the stalker was behind us the entire time. I kept my hand intertwined with my boyfriend's, and kept up the casual conversation we'd been having about how I hate geese. We got back up to my apartment and he got changed for bed while I grabbed some water. So I've never lived in an apartment before, and I don't know if it's odd or not, but this building has a wired telephone in each unit that rings when someone wants to be let in. Ours never rings unless it's Uber Eats, so my boyfriend was surprised when it started ringing late at night when neither of us had ordered anything. "Probably just some asshole playing a prank," I said, unhooking the phone from the wall and putting it in the kitchen cabinet. He accepted that without a struggle, and we laid down in bed. After he was soundly out, I got up, got dressed, grabbed a couple of things and headed downstairs in my thick winter coat. Sure enough, my fanboy was out there in the parking lot. He waved at me and jogged over, smiling broadly. "Hey man." "What do you want?" I said flatly. "Look man, I feel like we ended things awkwardly last time, and I just wanted to talk to you," he said. "So you stalked me?" "What?" He started to look angrier, his brows furrowing. "Nah man, I didn't stalk you. I just wanted to know when I could talk to you, but you always avoid me. Now you're walking around here with that skinny little bitch boy trying to rub it in my face, and I don't appreciate that." "Look man," he said, smiling again and stepping closer. "You want to go talk about this back at my place? Ditch the white boy and come hang out with me tonight. Please? I won't shoot up or nothing this time." He took another step closer to me. I saw in his right hand a dull, gleaming piece of metal, a folded-up switchblade. He smiled at me and I stepped back, shaking my head. His smile drained away into a deep scowl. "Bitch, I'm done asking. You're gonna come over to my place now and finish what we started," he growled, unfolding the knife and pointing it at me. This dude was 5'8" tops and skinny. I'm 6'3" and 200 pounds and regularly lift weights. Also, I had a 12-inch kitchen knife, which I drew from my coat pocket and levelled at his throat. He looked at my knife and then back at his and smiled again. Bro, I was just playing. We don't have to. We can just talk right here. Leave me and my boyfriend alone, I said, very quietly, or I will cut your face off and eat it. What the hell? I spent 8 years in juvie for stabbing a kid in middle school, I lied. He backed up, putting the knife back in his pocket. I took a step closer, holding my knife level. He backed away quickly, almost falling on the ice, until he was fully sprinting back to his place, and I was chasing him down with my knife, until he crossed the street and I stopped, slid the knife into my pocket, and watched him run back into his building. Then I went back up to my bedroom, told my boyfriend I'd just had to pee, and fell asleep. Back in 2013, I was walking home from my university at 1 a.m, which is what time the library closed. I usually didn't stay out that late though, because I was wary of walking alone at night. But I had a research project that I needed to work on, and I hadn't had any creepy encounters on my 15-minute walks home before. My little college town had a low crime rate, and being young and naive, I thought I was safe. At first I didn't think anything was off. I heard footsteps way behind me, but like I said, the library had recently closed, so I assumed it was just another student heading home. As I got further, I thought it was odd that there was still someone behind me, because there weren't many students who lived in my area, and usually didn't encounter people on my trips to and from campus. I told myself that I was being paranoid, as it was late and dark, and I was stressed about my paper. That's all. Now it's important to know that the long street I usually took to get home had some areas that were less pedestrian friendly. Weird sidewalk cut-offs, tripping hazards, overgrown hedges blocking the sidewalk, etc. It's one of those streets that the city swears it's going to fix, but they have to sort out the budget first, and then nothing ever happens. By this point I had come up with my own route to navigate these issues, and crossed the street at least twice to avoid the worst of them. I did my first crossing, and 20 seconds later so did the person behind me. I looked and saw that a guy walking behind me had crossed to my side of the street, in an inconvenient spot, and fine, whatever, someone else had a routine for getting down this weird street. Besides, he was still way behind me, so nothing to worry about. I got to my second crossing, and he crossed again, quicker this time. I looked back again and he was closer, more than 20 feet away, but definitely closer. I sped up and added 2 unnecessary crossings to my route, and he crossed to the same side as me both times. I was freaked out at this point and had no idea what to do but keep walking. I considered calling someone, but I worried that pulling out my phone would provoke him, and I wouldn't be quick enough. There was no one else around, just me and him. Once I was on my street, I considered sprinting to my apartment complex, but I was lucky that night. Some neighbors from across the street were hanging out outside, maybe 7 or 8 people. I had never spoken to these people before, but I jogged towards them and shouted, "Hey, how's it going?" and acted like we knew each other. They were obviously confused, but I quietly explained that I thought I was being followed, and thank God they played along. A minute later, one of them told me, "I think he's leaving." So I checked, and he was indeed gone. They asked if I was okay. Did I live far? Did I want to call the police? I declined. I hadn't gotten a good look at the guy's face, and I couldn't prove that I had been followed. I told them that I was fine now, thanked them, and finally got back to my apartment. I told my roommates what had happened in the morning, as they had been sleeping when I got home. They agreed that it wasn't a good idea to go to the police, and that it wasn't 100% certain that I had been followed. I was more careful for the rest of the year, and I never saw that guy again. I moved to another state several months later. I've told this story to other people, and most of them have said, it sounds like this guy may have been following you, but I don't know. And I understand their hesitation. He didn't say anything to me. I was able to keep my distance, and there could have been completely benign reasons for what had happened. But what was and still is troubling for me, though, is not knowing. I don't like having suspicions, but I read or hear accounts of other women who had similar experiences, some who did have confrontations. In situations like these, the uncertainty is enough to make you feel crazy. Remember the early days of the web? AOL software upgrades arrived in the mail on a CD-ROM, and family members would shout across the house at one another if an incoming call on the landline interrupted the painstaking 10 minutes it took to get from the America Online sign in screen to hearing "You've got mail" reverberate through the room. Recipients of multicolored chain emails, a serial killer camping out in a young girl's shower and killing her guard dog, truly pondered the threat against their luck for the next 7 years if they didn't abide by the message's command to forward it on to 7 friends. Better not risk it, we told ourselves, as we quickly typed out 7 email addresses in the recipient field. And finding everything there was to know about a person online, something anyone can do today with a few keystrokes and a credit card, was a lot harder to do back then. But not for Corey. I was 15 years old. At the time, ambiguous and exotic usernames like Pina Colada 33 or Brunette Baby 87 were all the rage. Naive as we early screen name pioneers were, this anonymity was smart. Social media was in its infancy. Xanga was the go-to haven for teens and tweens to vent their angst, while informing the world they were currently listening to screaming infidelities by Dashboard Confessional. Everyone was friends with Tom on MySpace. AIM didn't exist as a standalone messenger service just yet, so it was MSN Messenger or bust. But if you had a true AOL account like I did, you were set up with all you needed to discover this new, hyper-connected, free-for-all world of the early 2000s World Wide Web. Your own email inbox, a new page to create a personal profile, access to chat rooms on just about any topic or hobby you could possibly imagine. It was exhilarating, until it was terrifying. One afternoon I jumped into one of these chat rooms. ASL, 16 female Boston. I watched the usual exchange between total strangers scroll across my screen for several minutes, hoping to find my opportunity to finally chime in and introduce myself. Ultimately, though, I got bored and left the chat without typing a word. But then an instant message appeared on my screen. It said, "You didn't say anything. Why not?" "Who is this?" I responded, confused by the username I didn't recognize. "I'm Corey," he responded. "I'm 16, 8th grade in Lake Charles, Louisiana. What about you?" 16 and in 8th grade. Yikes. And yet I was intrigued. "So, you get held back twice or what?" I teased. And so the conversation began. We struck up a brief online friendship that afternoon. He shared a photo. Freckled face, brown hair, nothing I'd rate above a 5 on hot or not. Yet despite the friendliness, I refused to tell him where I was from or anything personal about me, beyond my first name and age. I knew little about the dangers of the internet, but I wasn't dumb either. My username was a fruity drink, and some numbers, right? Safe enough, I figured. For background, I did have one of those AOL user profiles. Its standard features included a profile picture and a questionnaire to fill out fun facts about yourself. My photo was one of me with several friends, with no indication of which one was me whatsoever. A few days later, Corey messaged me out of the blue. "You're beautiful." "What?" I thought. "Brunettes with green eyes, man," he responded. Somehow, despite my photo containing 3 other friends, he'd accurately identified me. "I would love to see you sometime," he wrote. I felt my skin prick. I politely told him something to the effect of that not being possible and quickly logged off. Friday the following week, I was sleeping over at my best friend's house. I was logged into my account in the background as we thirstily browsed cute guys on Hot or Not. Then a message came through. "Who's messaging you?" my friend asked. I knew. It was Corey. "Hey, you live in Houston. Your parents are James and Sarah Miller, and you live at 1655 South Grand. You know that feeling when you're on a roller coaster during a sharp drop and your heart jumps into your throat? That was that moment. Fortunately, we managed to find that AOL did, in fact, have a block user feature that night. That was it. So long, creepy 16-year-old middle schooler with scarily good online sleuthing skills. It didn't last long, though. The next day, a screen name similar to Corey's messaged me. He had another account, but I quickly blocked it. This happened 5 more times. I finally went dark for a while. Sure, I missed the thrill of seeing the yellow envelope appear in my virtual mailbox, but it was better than the threat of being harassed by Corey. A few weeks later, I got home from school. My little sister was a baby at the time, 14 years my junior, so she had a nanny who stayed with her during the day while my parents were at work. When I walked through the door of the kitchen, she handed the phone to me. "It's for you," she said with a quizzical look on her face. "Who is it?" I asked. "I really don't know. Some boy with a twang in his voice. Sounds like he's from East Texas or Louisiana." Oh, God. "Hello?" I finally muttered into the phone. "Hey, pretty thing, it's Corey. So my friend and I are all into the show Jackass. We're thinking of making a trip over to Houston and doing some pranks around town next week. How hilarious would it be if we surprised you at your front door?" I choked out a nervous laugh. I mumbled an excuse about having a quiz the next day and quickly hung up. For the next few weeks, I slept with a knife under my mattress. I was absolutely terrified I'd wake up to this Lake Charles stranger boy on the balcony outside my window. How did he get my phone number? But just as soon as he'd invaded my sense of security, he seemingly disappeared. No instant messages, no uninvited calls to my home. The knife finally went back into its respective kitchen drawer, and 2 months passed, and it felt glorious. Safe. Until the phone rang the first week of summer break. "Hi," the voice said curtly. "Who is this?" I politely demanded. "It's me, Corey." Now let me be clear, this wasn't the same voice I'd heard 2 months ago. That voice was dripping in southern syrup. It was young and full of mischief. This new voice was different. It was cold. It lacked any discernible accent, and it was older. I was speaking to a grown man. "I'm sorry I haven't been able to talk to you," he hurriedly blurted. Why did he sound rushed? "I feel terrible, but the police came to my house. They took my computers away from me. I can't say why, but don't worry, I'll come to Houston soon." And then he hung up. That was the last day I used that fruity username. I deleted that account and created a new one. I embarrassingly told my parents I'd made a huge mistake, despite having shared nothing that could have easily revealed my personal identity. Even if I had, the threat back then wasn't what it is now. This was nearly 20 years ago. People simply didn't have the online presences that they do today. As a teenager with no social media yet, I was virtually a ghost. But still, I was convinced I was somehow culpable for this stranger, this man, a predator who clearly had advanced knowledge of computers and the internet, singling me out and making it his mission to learn everything about me. through whatever means possible. He was determined to get to me, and I'm only grateful that even at 15, I knew better than to trust that this freckle-faced kid from an online chat room had fully benign intentions. 2 decades later, and I still wonder where Corey ended up. Hopefully behind bars. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.